Hey guys, today we're going north, far beyond the fjords and farmsteads we usually associate with the Viking Age, to a landscape of birch forests, winter darkness, and reindeer trails that could vanish overnight. The Vikings were traders, raiders, and colonists, but they were also practical people who learned, sometimes the hard way, that there were places where their usual rules didn't apply. In the far north of Scandinavia, they met a people who did not build towns in the Norse style, did not fight on the same terms, and were widely believed by the Vikings themselves to possess knowledge that could bend luck, weather, and fate. The question isn't really whether the Vikings were terrified to death. It's why a confident seafaring society carried a persistent, uneasy respect for one northern tribe, the Sami. And before we begin, if you enjoy calm, long-form history that takes its time and treats the past with care, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so these deep dives are easy to find later, and it helps you keep up with new documentaries as they come out. All right, let's step into the Arctic edge of the Viking world. To understand the Norse fear and fascination, we need to start with geography, because in the Viking Age, geography was never just a backdrop. The Norse heartlands, coastal Norway, Denmark, parts of Sweden, were tied together by sea routes, seasonal farming, and a worldview built around homesteads, assemblies, and honor. But north of the main farming belt, the land changes character. The growing season shrinks. Timber is different. The coastline breaks into a maze of islands and skerries. Inland, the mountains and plateaus open into wide tundra, where winter can swallow roads for months. In this zone, a different economy made sense. Mobility, deep knowledge of animal migrations, and the ability to live well without permanent fields. This was the world of the Sami, an indigenous people of northern Fennoscandia whose lifeways included hunting, fishing, trade, and, over time in many regions, reindeer herding as a cornerstone of survival. The Vikings knew the North was rich, not in wheat or vineyards, but in prestige goods that traveled far. Furs, especially from animals adapted to extreme cold, were valuable across Europe and the wider medieval world. Walrus, ivory, and whale products mattered. Down feathers, hides, and even dried fish could become the basis of wealth. A Norse chieftain's status was not only measured by land, it was also measured by access to rare commodities and the networks that supplied them. That meant the far north was not a blank on the map. It was an economic frontier, and frontiers are where stereotypes, anxieties, and power struggles cluster tightly together. In Norse written tradition, the Sami appear under names like Finns or Finner, terms that can be confusing today because they do not always correspond neatly to modern national identities. In saga literature and medieval accounts, these Finns are frequently associated with exceptional hunting skill, uncanny mobility over snow, and, most memorably, magic. The Norse word often used is seer, a form of sorcery in the Norse imagination associated with trance, prophecy, and the manipulation of outcomes. What matters for our story is not whether the Sami practiced exactly what the Norse called seer, but that the Norse repeatedly linked Sami people with powerful, dangerous knowledge. That association alone tells us something about the psychological map of the Viking world. There were forces in the north that even a warrior society preferred not to challenge directly. Part of that fear was practical. Viking warfare, when it happened on land, favored known terrain, supply lines, and battles where shields and numbers could matter. The far north disrupts all of that. A raiding party moving inland would face long distances with limited food sources, sudden storms, and a local population that did not need to defend fixed towns because their strength lay in movement and familiarity. If you can disappear into a winter landscape that your pursuer can barely read, then you don't need to defeat him in a set-piece battle. You only need to make the pursuit expensive, confusing, and frightening. In that setting, rumor becomes a weapon. A community that is said to control wind or cloud, a man's mind gains deterrence even before a spear is lifted. But we should be careful here, because the Sami were not simply a mystery tribe on the edge of the civilized world. They were active participants in trade networks that connected the Arctic to the North Sea and beyond. Norse chieftains sought northern goods, and Sami communities sought iron tools, textiles, and other resources that made life easier in harsh climates. This is one reason the relationship is hard to reduce to a simple story of Viking aggression and Sami resistance. There were moments of contact that look like negotiation, gift exchange, and mutual dependence. There were also moments that look like coercion, systems of tribute and taxation imposed by expanding Norse and later Scandinavian authorities. Frontier relationships often contain both, trade that enriches and pressure that extracts. One of the most revealing windows into the early Viking Age North is an account usually associated with a Norwegian chieftain and traveler named Othere, who described voyages far north and interactions tied to wealth from hunting and tribute. His testimony, filtered through the literate courts of the South, suggests a world where northern resources were measured, counted, and politically meaningful. Even when the South imagined the North as strange, it also understood it as profitable. That combination, profit and strangeness, is exactly where fear grows. When people believe a remote community has both valuable goods and unfamiliar powers, stereotypes harden quickly. So what did Norse fear look like in practice? Not the kind of cinematic panic we might imagine, but caution, ritual, and avoidance. Saga material often hints that some Norse sought Sami specialists for specific purposes: guidance in hunting, knowledge of the land, and especially prophecy or luck. At the same time, the same literature frames this knowledge as morally ambiguous, effective, but risky. That tells us that Vikings did not simply dismiss Sami practices as nonsense. They treated them like a technology, something that could work, something you might want, and something you might regret touching. In a world where storms could erase ships and winter could kill a household, the line between religion, superstition, and survival strategy was thin. If a person claimed the ability to influence outcomes, people listened, especially people who had watched a year's work vanish with one early frost. There's also a deeper cultural tension here, and it's worth stating plainly. The Viking Age was a period of intense identity-making in Scandinavia. Chieftains competed for followers, poets crafted genealogies, and communities defined themselves through law and custom. In that kind of society, the other is often used as a mirror. The Sami became, in Norse imagination, the opposite of the settled farmer warrior. Mobile rather than rooted, masters of snow rather than sea, linked to spirits rather than assemblies. Once you've placed a neighbor into that symbolic role, every unusual skill can be turned into evidence of supernatural power. A person who skis effortlessly becomes inhumanly fast. A hunter who reads tracks becomes a mind reader. A drum used in ritual becomes a tool to command fate. This is how frontier mythologies form. Real differences in ecology and culture become exaggerated into legends. But even legends have foundations. The Sami did possess highly specialized knowledge of northern environments. Their clothing systems, built for cold, were not a curiosity. They were engineering. Their navigation skills, reading wind, snow, animal movement, and seasonal patterns, were not magic. But to outsiders they could look like it. And their spiritual traditions, which included forms of shamanic practice in some regions, involved trance and ritual objects that would have appeared striking to a Norse visitor. When you combine environmental mastery with visible ritual, you create the perfect conditions for fear-based storytelling. The Norse did not need to understand the details to feel the effect. Now, a crucial point for an honest documentary, the phrase "terrified the Vikings to death" is a modern way of compressing something more complex. The Vikings were not a single unified people, and their relationships with the Sami varied by place and century. Some Norse families lived near Sami groups and interacted routinely. Some probably intermarried. Some traded peacefully for generations. And yet the repeated literary motif of Sami sorcery suggests that even amid everyday contact, a layer of awe persisted. Think of it this way. The Norse might negotiate like partners on one day, then on another day when the wind shifted, the hunt failed, or a child fell ill, whisper that the North held powers they didn't want to offend. Fear doesn't have to be constant to be influential. It only has to be plausible at the wrong moment. As the Viking Age progressed and Scandinavian kingdoms formed stronger structures, the frontier hardened. Tribute could become taxation. Rights to hunt or fish could be claimed by distant elites. When states expand, they tend to redraw relationships into hierarchies. In that process, the Sami were increasingly described not as partners but as subjects, people to be counted, taxed, or converted. This is where the earlier aura of fear begins to transform. States prefer predictability. They attempt to regulate what they once called magic, to classify what they once found uncanny. And yet, even as official power grew, the older stories did not disappear. They lingered in memory, in folklore, and in the undertones of how Southerners talked about the North. What makes this topic resonate with modern Tier 1 audiences is that it flips the usual Viking narrative. We're used to seeing Vikings as the force that scares everyone else. Here, the roles blur. The Vikings enter a world where their advantages, ships, numbers, coastal mobility, mean less, and where another people's expertise sets the terms. It's also a reminder that history is rarely a simple ladder of advanced and primitive. The Norse were impressive navigators. The Sami were impressive Arctic specialists. Each possessed forms of intelligence shaped by landscape. When those landscapes overlapped, power became negotiable, and that negotiation produced the kind of uneasy respect that later storytellers turned into fear. So if we strip away the modern exaggeration, what remains is still compelling. If we look more closely at the written sources from medieval Scandinavia and Iceland, we begin to see how layered this relationship truly was. The sagas, though written down centuries after the height of the Viking Age, preserve traditions that reflect older attitudes. In several accounts, Norse leaders are described as seeking out Sami individuals specifically for prophecy or assistance in times of uncertainty. These episodes are rarely framed as casual or trivial. They carry tension. The Norse characters often approach with a mixture of need and unease, aware that they are entering a space where their own cultural rules do not fully apply. That detail matters. The Vikings were not strangers to spiritual practice themselves. Norse religion included rituals, sacrifices, omens, and practitioners of seer. Yet saga authors repeatedly emphasized that Sami magic was somehow stronger, stranger, or more dangerous. In some stories, a Norse household attributes illness or misfortune to a Sami curse. In others, a chieftain gains insight from a Sami seer that alters his political future. Whether these stories reflect real events or literary exaggeration is less important than what they reveal about perception. The Sami were imagined as people whose knowledge operated at the edge of what the Norse considered controllable. There is also a practical dimension that helps explain this reputation. In the far north, survival depends on anticipating environmental shifts that outsiders may not even notice. A sudden change in wind direction, the behavior of reindeer, the thickness of river ice, these are not small details. They determine whether a journey succeeds or ends in disaster. A community that can read those signals with precision appears almost prophetic to someone without that training. Over time, environmental expertise becomes reframed as supernatural foresight. Trade deepened this connection further. Archaeological evidence shows sustained exchange between Norse communities and Sami groups. Iron tools moved north. Furs and other Arctic goods moved south. In some burial sites, objects reflect this interaction, suggesting not isolation, but a frontier of contact. Yet frontiers are rarely equal spaces. Norse elites increasingly viewed northern territories as sources of wealth to be organized and taxed. The language of tribute appears in several early accounts, implying that Sami communities were required, at times, to provide goods to powerful chieftains. It is here that fear and control intersect. When a dominant group extracts resources from a neighboring people, it often reinforces stories that justify hierarchy. Portraying the Sami as mysterious or dangerous could serve two purposes at once. It warned ordinary Norse farmers to tread carefully in the north, and it elevated the status of those leaders who claimed they could manage or command such forces. If a chieftain could say he had negotiated with the sorcerers of the north, it enhanced his prestige. However, the Sami were not passive figures in this story. Their mobility and deep knowledge of terrain gave them leverage. Unlike settled agricultural communities, they were less vulnerable to direct conquest through land seizure. You cannot easily confiscate fields that do not exist in the same way. Seasonal migration patterns made rigid control difficult. In this sense, the very structure of Sami society functioned as a quiet form of resistance to the expansionist tendencies of emerging Scandinavian kingdoms. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia from the late Viking Age onward, attitudes shifted again. Christian authorities were often more openly hostile toward indigenous spiritual practices, labeling them as pagan or dangerous. What had once been described in sagas as powerful seer increasingly became framed as forbidden sorcery. This transition marks an important turning point. The earlier Norse fear was mixed with respect and even collaboration. Later religious structures sought to suppress what they did not accept. Yet even then, the older image of the North endured in folklore. Stories persisted of Sami drums, of weatherworking, of journeys across impossible distances. These tales traveled far beyond Scandinavia and became part of a broader European imagination about the Arctic as a place of hidden knowledge. The Vikings, in this larger story, were no longer the central figures. Instead, they became one chapter in a much longer history of cultural encounter in the far north. What we ultimately see is not a simple narrative of terror, but a layered frontier relationship shaped by trade, environment, belief, and power. The Sami did not defeat the Vikings in a decisive battle that ended in dramatic collapse. Rather, they occupied a space the Vikings could not fully dominate, intellectually or geographically. And in that unresolved space, where ambition met limitation, stories of fear took root and endured. As Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated power between the 10th and 12th centuries, the northern frontier gradually shifted from a zone of flexible exchange to one of firmer political ambition. Kings in Norway and later authorities in Sweden began to formalize claims over northern territories that had previously existed in looser networks of influence. Tribute systems became more structured. Taxation, particularly in valuable goods such as furs, was no longer simply a matter of a local chieftain's arrangement but part of royal administration. For the Sami, this transformation introduced new pressures. Their seasonal movements and decentralized social organization had once allowed them to negotiate locally and adapt quickly. Now they faced distant authorities who viewed land in territorial terms and resources in fiscal terms. The contrast between worldviews became sharper. Norse and later Scandinavian elites increasingly defined sovereignty as control over fixed boundaries. Sami communities, whose relationship to land was based on use, migration, and ecological rhythm, did not fit neatly into that framework. This mismatch often produced tension, though not always open conflict. Written records from later medieval periods show disputes over hunting grounds and fishing rights. They also reveal that Sami individuals sometimes acted as intermediaries, trading partners, guides, and knowledge holders for southern merchants and officials. In other words, adaptation continued. The frontier did not freeze into hostility. It remained dynamic, but the balance of power was slowly tilting. Christianization added another layer. Missionaries traveling north sought to replace indigenous spiritual practices with church structures. Ritual drums and sacred sites, once viewed by Norse pagans with wary fascination, were now condemned as symbols of superstition. The earlier ambiguity, fear mixed with respect, gave way to clearer moral judgment under Christian theology. Practices that had once inspired awe became targets for reform or suppression. Yet even within this changing religious landscape, practical dependence persisted. Northern trade did not disappear. Kings still relied on Arctic goods. Merchants still required guides familiar with winter routes. The image of the Sami as uniquely skilled in navigating extreme environments remained intact. If anything, it became more entrenched. Official policy might aim to regulate or convert, but daily survival in the north still required cooperation. It is important to remember that much of what we know about this period comes from sources written by outsiders, Norse or later Scandinavian authors. The Sami voice is largely indirect in the early record. That imbalance has shaped the narrative. When medieval writers described the Sami as sorcerers or weather workers, they were interpreting unfamiliar traditions through their own cultural lens. Modern scholarship approaches these descriptions more cautiously, recognizing them as reflections of perception rather than literal documentation. Archaeology has helped rebalance that view. Excavations in northern Scandinavia reveal continuity and adaptation rather than isolation. Settlement patterns, tools, and trade goods show a society deeply engaged with regional networks while maintaining distinct cultural practices. Far from being a hidden or marginal people, the Sami were integral to the economic fabric of the North. So when we return to the idea that this was the only tribe that terrified the Vikings, we can see the deeper truth beneath the dramatic phrasing. The Vikings encountered in the Sami a society whose strengths lay in different domains: environmental mastery, mobility, and spiritual tradition rooted in Arctic landscapes. That difference created uncertainty, and uncertainty, in a world where survival depended on knowledge, could easily evolve into fear. But fear here should be understood as acknowledgement of limits. The Vikings were formidable along coasts and rivers. They excelled in maritime expansion. In the far northern interior, however, their advantages narrowed. They entered a domain where another people set the rhythm of life. Rather than conquering outright, they adapted, traded, negotiated, and occasionally mythologized. In the long arc of history, that mutual awareness shaped both societies. Norse culture incorporated northern goods and stories. Sami communities navigated expanding political systems while preserving key elements of identity. The frontier between them was never static. It shifted with climate, economy, and belief. And within that shifting space, the legend of Northern power endured, not as a tale of annihilation, but as a reminder that even the Vikings recognized when they had reached the edge of their certainty. There is also an environmental dimension to this story that is often overlooked, yet it may be the most important of all. The Viking Age coincided with a relatively mild climatic phase in parts of the North Atlantic world, sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period. This allowed Norse expansion into Iceland, Greenland, and briefly even North America. Warmer temperatures supported longer growing seasons in marginal lands. For coastal Scandinavians, this period encouraged confidence. Confidence in ships, in farming, in outward movement. But the Arctic interior followed its own rhythms. Even in milder centuries, northern winters remained severe and unpredictable. Storm systems moved quickly across open tundra. Snow conditions could shift from stable to dangerous in a matter of hours. For communities rooted in agriculture, such volatility posed serious risk. For communities like the Sami, whose lifeways were built around flexibility and seasonal adaptation, volatility was expected. They did not attempt to dominate the environment. They synchronized with it. This difference in environmental philosophy shaped perception. The Norse worldview often emphasized control, clearing land, building farms, establishing legal assemblies, claiming territory. Success was visible in structures: halls, fences, ships. Sami's success was less architectural and more ecological. It resided in knowledge passed through observation and practice. To an outsider, that knowledge could appear intangible, even mystical, because it left fewer monumental traces. When medieval writers describe Sami weather magic, we can interpret it as a metaphor for this environmental fluency. If a Sami guide predicted a storm and chose a safer route, and the storm then struck exactly as anticipated, it would reinforce the impression of supernatural foresight. Over generations, practical forecasting becomes legendary power. The line between skill and sorcery blurs in memory. We should also consider psychology. The Viking Age was a period of ambition. Norse ships reached distant shores, and warriors carved reputations across Europe. In such an expansionist culture, encountering a boundary, geographical or cultural, that resists easy integration can be unsettling. The far north did not offer straightforward conquest or settlement on a large scale. It required humility, patience, and partnership that alone may have contributed to the aura surrounding the Sami. They represented a limit point in the Viking mental map. Importantly, there is little evidence of large-scale, decisive warfare between Vikings and Sami in the way we see Norse campaigns elsewhere. The absence of dramatic conquest narratives is itself telling. Instead of epic battles, we find taxation records, trade agreements, scattered references in sagas, and gradual state expansion. The relationship was persistent, not explosive. It unfolded over centuries rather than in a single defining clash. By the late medieval period, as Scandinavian monarchies strengthened and Christianity became dominant, official attitudes hardened further. Sami spiritual practices faced increasing pressure. Yet even then, royal authorities recognized the economic value of northern expertise. Reindeer products, fish, and furs continued to flow southward. The frontier never disappeared. It was absorbed into larger political frameworks. Today, historians approach this subject with greater sensitivity to indigenous perspectives. The older narrative of mysterious sorcerers terrifying Vikings has given way to a more balanced understanding of intercultural contact. The Sami were not supernatural adversaries. They were neighbors whose adaptive strategies differed profoundly from those of agrarian Norse society. Fear arose not from spectacle, but from difference combined with respect. In that sense, the story remains powerful. It challenges the image of Vikings as universally dominant and reminds us that history is shaped by environment as much as by ambition. Power is contextual. On open seas, the Vikings excelled. In Arctic interiors, they encountered equals in expertise. And when two skilled societies meet at the edge of their respective strengths, what follows is rarely simple conquest. It is negotiation, adaptation, and the slow weaving of legend. So the tribe that terrified the Vikings did so not through overwhelming force, but through mastery of a world the Vikings did not fully command. That quiet mastery, rooted in landscape, memory, and resilience, proved more enduring than any single raid or voyage. Another important layer to consider is how memory reshapes relationships over time. By the time many of the Icelandic sagas were written down in the 13th century, Scandinavia had already changed dramatically. Christianity was established. Kingdoms were more centralized. The Viking Age as an era of overseas raiding had largely passed. Writers looking back at earlier centuries were not simply recording events. They were interpreting a past that already felt distant. In that retrospective lens, the Sami often appear as figures at the edge of the known world, liminal, powerful, slightly outside ordinary society. That portrayal reflects medieval literary style as much as historical reality. Saga authors frequently heightened contrasts to explore themes of fate, honor, and destiny. When a Norse hero consults a Sami seer in a story, the scene underscores tension between certainty and uncertainty, between planned action and unseen forces. The Sami character becomes a narrative device for confronting the limits of human control. Yet behind the literary framing lies a steady historical truth. The North remained a region that resisted full assimilation for centuries. Even as administrative structures expanded, Sami communities maintained distinct languages, traditions, and seasonal patterns. Cultural persistence itself can generate myth. When a society endures despite political pressure, outsiders may attribute that endurance to hidden strengths. There is also evidence of cultural exchange moving in both directions. Certain Norse myths and ritual elements show possible northern influences, though scholars debate the extent. Trade routes did not only carry goods, they carried ideas. Clothing styles, technologies suited for snow travel, and specialized hunting tools demonstrate adaptation across cultural lines. The frontier was not a wall. It was porous, even if uneven in power. Over time, however, as state authorities imposed stricter systems of taxation and land regulation from the late medieval into the early modern period, the balance shifted more decisively. Written records increasingly defined Sami lands in terms of ownership under crowns rather than communal usage. Missionary campaigns intensified. Drums and sacred sites were confiscated in some areas. These developments mark a departure from the earlier Viking-era dynamic of wary respect. The older fear softened into administrative control. Still, the memory of northern sorcery lingered in folklore long after official policy dismissed it. In Scandinavian rural traditions, stories survived of wind knots tied in cords, of distant shamans influencing weather, of travelers who ventured too far into the mountains and encountered forces they did not understand. These tales were not historical reports, but they preserved emotional truths about boundary spaces, places where certainty fades. For modern audiences, this history offers something deeper than a simple reversal of Viking dominance. It reveals how power is relative to environment and knowledge. The Vikings were innovators of maritime technology and social organization suited to their landscapes. The Sami were innovators of Arctic adaptation. Each excelled within its own ecological framework. When those frameworks overlapped, neither could claim total superiority. That may be the most enduring lesson in the phrase, "the only tribe that terrified the Vikings." The fear was not of annihilation. It was the recognition that there are domains where even the most confident culture must proceed carefully. In the snow-covered plateaus and forested valleys of the far north, Norse ships meant little. Reputation meant less. Survival depended on skills they did not fully possess. And so the story settles into perspective. Not a dramatic clash ending in destruction, but a long frontier encounter shaped by trade, belief, adaptation, and gradual political change. The Sami did not need to defeat the Vikings in battle to leave an imprint on their imagination. They only needed to remain themselves, distinct, knowledgeable, and resilient in a landscape that rewarded exactly those qualities. In the end, what endured was not terror, but respect transformed into legend. And in that transformation, we glimpse a quieter truth about history. Sometimes the greatest power is not expansion, but the ability to thrive where others hesitate to tread. If we widen the lens even further, the encounter between the Vikings and the Sami becomes part of a broader pattern seen throughout history. Maritime societies pushing outward until they meet environments that demand entirely different forms of expertise. The Norse expansion across the North Atlantic was built on shipbuilding innovation, navigational skill, and flexible political organization. But those strengths were calibrated for coastlines, rivers, and island networks. The Arctic interior required something else, an intimacy with land rather than sea, and a seasonal rhythm that could not be hurried. This helps explain why the Sami occupied such a distinct position in Norse consciousness. They were not overseas enemies to be raided and left behind. They were neighbors whose territory could not simply be sailed past. The frontier with the Sami was long, irregular, and continuous. It demanded ongoing interaction rather than a single campaign. In that ongoing contact, perceptions deepened and solidified. It is also worth noting that Norse society itself was not uniform. Northern Norwegian chieftains likely had far more direct and regular contact with Sami communities than Danish elites or Icelandic settlers. For some, the relationship would have felt ordinary, part of everyday trade and seasonal exchange. For others, especially those hearing stories secondhand, the North could seem distant and uncanny. The further one moved from the frontier, the more the image of the Sami may have shifted from practical partners to legendary figures. Over generations, such layered perceptions accumulated. Practical dependence on northern goods coexisted with stories of northern sorcery. Administrative attempts to tax coexisted with acknowledgement of specialized skill. Missionary efforts to reform coexisted with quiet reliance on indigenous knowledge for travel and survival. The result was not a clean narrative arc, but a complex coexistence. Modern historical research has increasingly emphasized this complexity. Archaeology, linguistics, and environmental studies all point toward sustained interaction rather than isolation. Place names in northern Scandinavia preserve traces of Sami presence. Norse material culture appears in Sami contexts and vice versa. The frontier was a meeting ground where identities were negotiated rather than erased overnight. So when we think about the idea that the Sami terrified the Vikings, we should understand it as a reflection of that negotiation. Fear often arises when a society encounters a competence it does not fully share. The Vikings were formidable sailors, but they were not Arctic pastoralists in the Sami sense. They were skilled warriors, but warfare was not the defining feature of survival in the tundra. They were builders of halls and farms, but permanent structures were less central to a mobile northern economy. In that contrast, the Vikings faced a reminder that strength is situational. Their confidence, forged in longships and coastal strongholds, met a landscape where snowshoes and reindeer trails mattered more. The Sami did not overpower them through conquest. They held ground through adaptation. And adaptation, in the long span of history, often proves more enduring than expansion. Today, the Sami remain a living indigenous people across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, with cultural traditions that continue despite centuries of pressure. Their survival into the modern era underscores the resilience that once shaped Viking perceptions. The old stories of sorcery may no longer define public understanding, but they echo faintly as reminders of a time when even the most confident seafarers recognized a boundary they could not easily cross. In the end, this is not a tale of dramatic collapse or singular terror. It is a story about limits, respect, and the meeting of different intelligences shaped by different lands. The Vikings reached far across oceans, but in the quiet expanse of the Arctic North, they encountered a people whose mastery required acknowledgement. And sometimes acknowledgement, especially from a culture as bold as the Vikings, is the clearest sign of all. As we bring this story toward its wider historical horizon, it becomes clear that what endured between the Vikings and the Sami was not a single dramatic moment, but a long-term coexistence shaped by adaptation on both sides. The Viking Age, roughly spanning the late 8th to the 11th century, was only one chapter in a relationship that began earlier and continued long after Norse longships stopped appearing on distant shores. The northern frontier outlived the Viking raids. It outlived the sagas. It even outlived the medieval kingdoms that first tried to formalize control over it. One of the reasons the idea of the Sami terrifying the Vikings remains compelling is because it disrupts a familiar power narrative. In much of popular history, the Vikings appear as the unpredictable force, descending on monasteries, reshaping trade routes, founding cities. But in the Arctic North, that dynamic subtly reversed. The Vikings entered a world where their usual advantages were reduced. Ships could not cross mountain plateaus. Farming knowledge had limited value in tundra zones. Military organization meant little if supply lines froze or vanished in snowstorms. In that environment, the Sami were not peripheral, they were central. Over time, Norse settlers in northern Norway learned to navigate this reality. Some integrated aspects of Sami knowledge into their own seasonal practices. Archaeological findings suggest overlapping economic zones where Norse farms and Sami activity coexisted in relative proximity. This was not a sealed border but a shifting gradient. Cultural exchange did not erase difference, but it softened rigid divisions. The frontier became less a line and more a shared landscape negotiated year by year. Yet even as coexistence became routine in many areas, the symbolic power of the North persisted in storytelling. Medieval literature often places transformative encounters in remote spaces, mountains, forests, Arctic expanses. These are settings where heroes confront forces larger than themselves. In that literary tradition, the Sami became associated with insight into fate, weather, and hidden knowledge. The portrayal reveals as much about Norse psychology as about Sami culture. It reflects a society aware that not all mastery is visible in halls of timber and stone. Some mastery is quieter, embedded in patterns of migration, memory, and seasonal movement. When Scandinavian monarchies consolidated further in the later Middle Ages and early modern period, their policies increasingly aimed at defining and incorporating northern territories. Administrative borders hardened. Tax registers were compiled. Missionaries intensified efforts to reshape spiritual life. These processes reduced the space for ambiguity that had characterized earlier centuries. Fear gradually gave way to bureaucratic categorization, but categorization never fully erased cultural resilience. Sami communities adapted to new pressures while preserving language, oral tradition, and connections to land. In this sense, the earlier Viking perception of a people who could not be easily absorbed proved accurate. The resilience that once inspired myths of sorcery translated, over centuries, into cultural endurance. Modern historical scholarship now approaches this subject with a more balanced framework. Instead of asking whether the Vikings were literally terrified, historians explore how environmental difference, economic interdependence, and spiritual misunderstanding combine to shape perception. Fear is reframed as respect mixed with uncertainty. The Arctic was not a void beyond civilization. It was a distinct ecological and cultural sphere that required humility from those who entered it. For contemporary audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, countries with their own histories of frontier encounters, this story resonates on a broader level. It reminds us that expansion is rarely absolute. Every advancing society eventually reaches a landscape where its strengths must adapt or yield. The Vikings met that landscape in the north of Scandinavia. The Sami, rooted in that terrain for generations, embodied a different kind of power. Not conquest, but continuity. So when we reflect on the phrase, the only tribe that terrified the Vikings, we can understand it not as sensational exaggeration, but as a poetic shorthand for a deeper truth. The Vikings were bold, innovative, and often dominant along the coasts of Europe. Yet in the Arctic interior, they encountered a people whose expertise they could not replicate and whose land they could not simply command. That recognition, quiet, practical, and enduring, left its mark on memory. In the end, the story is less about fear and more about boundaries. Boundaries of climate, boundaries of knowledge, boundaries of cultural confidence. The Sami did not defeat the Vikings in battle. They did something subtler and, in many ways, more powerful. They demonstrated that mastery is always relative to place. And in the long, cold light of the northern sky, even the most formidable seafarers understood that truth. As we step back from individual episodes and look at the full arc of this relationship, the encounter between the Vikings and the Sami begins to feel less like an isolated curiosity and more like a defining feature of Northern European history. For centuries, the Scandinavian world was shaped not only by voyages westward to Iceland and Greenland or southward into continental Europe, but also by its steady, complex interaction with the Arctic frontier to the north and east. What makes this frontier unique is that it was never completely distant. Unlike England or Francia, the lands inhabited by the Sami were directly adjacent to Norse settlements. There was no ocean separating them, no clear cultural boundary that could be crossed and left behind. Instead, there was a long transitional zone where farming communities gradually gave way to hunting grounds, mountain plateaus, and migratory routes. This proximity meant that Norse and Sami societies developed a familiarity with one another that was both practical and psychological. In practical terms, the northern economy depended on cooperation. Arctic products, furs, hides, fish, whale materials, and later reindeer goods were integrated into wider Scandinavian trade networks. Chieftains in Norway increased their wealth not only through raiding but also through control of northern trade. Access to Sami goods strengthened political authority. This alone ensured that the relationship would be sustained over generations. Psychologically, however, closeness can intensify difference. When two societies occupy neighboring ecological zones but rely on different survival strategies, the contrast becomes more visible. Norse farmers valued fixed homesteads, inheritance, and clearly defined property lines. Sami communities emphasized mobility, seasonal patterns, and flexible land use. To the Norse eye, this mobility could appear elusive or even unsettling. A people who do not anchor themselves to a single visible estate may seem harder to categorize, harder to tax, harder to command. It is within this tension that the language of fear developed. Not fear in the sense of constant terror, but fear as recognition of unpredictability. The Sami could move across snow with efficiency that astonished outsiders. They could navigate terrain that disoriented unfamiliar travelers. Their spiritual practices, centered in some regions around drums, trance states, and symbolic cosmologies, presented an alternative framework for understanding misfortune and fate. In a pre-scientific age where storms, illness, and failed harvests had no modern explanation, attributing unusual outcomes to northern magic provided a narrative that made sense within Norse belief systems. We should also remember that Norse culture itself placed great weight on honor and reputation. Stories were a form of social currency. If tales circulated that the Sami could influence weather or foresee events, those tales shaped behavior. A cautious distance could become tradition. Over time, repetition transformed caution into legend. The Sami became, in saga literature, figures who stood slightly outside ordinary society. Respected, sometimes sought out, but rarely fully integrated. As the medieval period progressed and Scandinavian monarchies extended firmer administrative structures into the north, the older language of mystical fear began to fade in official records. Bureaucracies prefer measurable categories. Tax assessments replaced saga descriptions. Missionaries recorded spiritual practices not as powerful, but as pagan. Yet folklore does not vanish easily. rural communities continued to tell stories of the North as a place of hidden knowledge and quiet strength. In modern scholarship, this layered history is increasingly understood as an example of intercultural adaptation rather than simple domination. The Vikings did not conquer the Sami in a single decisive campaign, nor did the Sami overthrow Norse authority. Instead, both societies adjusted to each other's presence across centuries. Trade created interdependence. Political ambition created pressure. Environmental realities imposed limits on both. For contemporary viewers, especially in countries shaped by their own frontier histories, this narrative offers a thoughtful counterpoint to more dramatic tales of conquest. It suggests that power is rarely absolute. Even the most outward-looking society encounters regions where its tools and assumptions must change. The Vikings mastered shipbuilding, navigation, and coastal expansion. The Sami mastered Arctic adaptation and seasonal resilience. Each held expertise that the other lacked. So when modern titles describe the Sami as the only tribe that terrified the Vikings, we can reinterpret that phrase as a recognition of balance. The Vikings were formidable where water connected communities. In the deep north, however, land and climate dictated new rules. The Sami understood those rules intimately. That understanding commanded respect, and respect, when filtered through medieval imagination, became fear. In the final analysis, what endured was not conflict alone, but coexistence shaped by mutual awareness. The Vikings did not abandon the North. They engaged with it. The Sami did not disappear. They adapted and persisted. The frontier between them was not a battlefield defined by one climactic moment. It was a living boundary, shifting with seasons and centuries. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. History is often told through dramatic victories and defeats, yet some of its most significant encounters unfold quietly, through daily exchange, cultural misunderstanding, adaptation, and endurance. As we reach the quiet conclusion of this story, it's worth reflecting on how memory transforms reality. The Vikings, in modern imagination, are often cast as unstoppable, masters of the sea, architects of sudden raids, founders of distant settlements. Yet history rarely supports such simple dominance. Every expanding society encounters edges to its influence. In the far north of Scandinavia, that edge was not marked by a fortress or a single battle, but by climate, terrain, and a people whose expertise could not be easily replaced. The Sami inhabited one of Europe's most demanding environments long before the Viking Age began. Their seasonal cycles were calibrated to migration patterns, snow conditions, and shifting light. Knowledge was cumulative and local, passed carefully across generations. Survival depended less on conquest and more on continuity. When Norse settlers and traders moved northward, they stepped into a system already adapted to the land in ways their own culture was not. This is where the emotional undertone of the story becomes clear. The Vikings were confident because they had reason to be. Their ships outperformed many contemporaries. Their social networks supported expansion. Their mythology celebrated boldness. But confidence shaped in one ecological zone does not automatically translate to another. In Arctic interiors, ships are irrelevant. Agricultural surplus shrinks. Navigation relies not on stars above open water, but on subtle signs embedded in snow and forest. The Sami did not need to defeat the Vikings militarily to command their respect. They simply needed to remain essential within their own environment. Norse chieftains who wanted access to northern wealth often relied on Sami intermediaries. Travelers required guidance. Trade required trust. Even as Scandinavian states gradually extended administrative systems into northern territories, they could not eliminate reliance on local expertise. That reliance tempered ambition. Over time, the dramatic language of terror faded into quieter forms of governance. Taxation replaced tribute. Missionaries replaced ritual specialists. Written law replaced oral negotiation. Yet the core reality persisted. The North could not be fully controlled without understanding it. And understanding it required acknowledging those who knew it best. Modern audiences sometimes look for decisive turning points. A final confrontation, a moment where one side clearly prevails. But in this case, the absence of such a moment is precisely the point. The relationship between Vikings and Sami unfolded over centuries without a singular collapse or conquest defining it. Instead, it evolved gradually, shaped by trade, belief, adaptation, and shifting political structures. There is something instructive in that gradualism. It reminds us that fear in history is often a reflection of uncertainty rather than imminent destruction. The Vikings did not fear annihilation at Sami hands. They feared miscalculation, storms unpredicted, terrain misunderstood, spiritual forces unrecognized. In a pre-modern world where the margin for error was thin, miscalculation could be fatal. Respecting northern knowledge was therefore not superstition alone. It was pragmatic caution. Today, the Sami continue to maintain cultural traditions across Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Languages survive. Reindeer herding endures in modern forms. Political movements advocate for indigenous rights and recognition. The long continuity of Sami presence underscores the resilience that once shaped Viking perceptions. What medieval storytellers framed as sorcery can now be understood as expertise born of environment. In the end, the phrase, "the only tribe that terrified the Vikings," captures attention because it reverses expectation. But the deeper truth is quieter and more enduring. The Sami represented a boundary the Vikings could not easily cross, not because of overwhelming force, but because of environmental mastery and cultural difference. They embodied a reminder that no society, however bold, is universally dominant. And perhaps that is the lasting significance of this encounter. History is not a straight line of expansion. It is a mosaic of intersecting worlds, each shaped by land, climate, and memory. The Vikings sailed widely and left their mark across continents. Yet in the Arctic North, they found a people who did not yield easily to narrative simplification. The Sami endured, adapted, and remained. In that endurance lies the quiet answer to the legend. The Vikings were not undone by terror. They were confronted with limits, and they recognized them. Under the long northern sky, amid forests and frozen plateaus, Even the most confident seafarers learned that mastery depends on place. And in that lesson, the story finds its calm and lasting power. Before we close completely, there is one final dimension worth considering: how this story speaks to the broader nature of historical memory itself. When modern titles describe the Sami as the only tribe that terrified the Vikings, they compress centuries of nuanced interaction into a single dramatic line. That compression tells us less about literal fear and more about how we, today, are drawn to reversals of power. We expect the Vikings to dominate, so when we hear of a people who unsettled them, it captures our imagination. But if we slow down, as historians must, we see that what unsettled the Vikings was not simply another armed force. It was difference grounded in landscape. The Arctic North imposed its own authority. It dictated survival terms without negotiation. The Sami, shaped by generations of adaptation to that authority, embodied a form of competence that could not be easily transplanted or imitated. That is a subtler and more enduring kind of power than battlefield victory. Throughout history, expanding societies often misinterpret local expertise as mysticism. When Romans entered northern forests, they attributed unusual knowledge to druidic ritual. When European explorers encountered indigenous navigators in the Pacific, they sometimes described their skills as almost supernatural. The Viking encounter with the Sami fits into that broader pattern. Where knowledge is highly specialized and outsiders lack context, explanation tends to drift toward the supernatural. Yet the true foundation of Sami resilience was ecological intelligence. Understanding animal migration routes, snow conditions, river systems, and seasonal timing required observation across lifetimes. It required collective memory rather than written manuals. In societies without centralized bureaucracies, knowledge is carried in story, song, and practice. That can appear mysterious to cultures accustomed to visible institutions. Over centuries, as Scandinavian kingdoms solidified and later modern states formed, political structures increasingly overshadowed older frontier relationships. Industrialization, technological change, and centralized governance altered northern economies. But even then, the Arctic environment did not become fully subordinate to southern authority. Harsh winters still demanded preparation. Remote terrain still required local familiarity. Modern infrastructure reduced some barriers, but it did not erase them. In this long view, the Viking Age becomes a vivid early chapter in a much longer narrative of coexistence and tension between centralized power and indigenous adaptation. The Sami survived not because they overwhelmed the Vikings in combat, but because their way of life was deeply aligned with the environment. Alignment, rather than expansion, proved durable. For viewers today in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, societies shaped by their own encounters between settlers and indigenous peoples, this story resonates quietly. It invites reflection on how narratives of dominance often obscure interdependence. It reminds us that cultural contact is rarely one-sided. Even powerful societies borrow, adapt, and recalibrate when faced with unfamiliar landscapes. So in the end, the legend of the tribe that terrified the Vikings becomes something more thoughtful. It becomes a story about humility at the edge of empire, The Vikings pushed outward across seas with confidence born of innovation. But in the Arctic North, innovation required listening. It required recognizing that strength is not universal. It is contextual. The Sami did not stand as mythical sorcerers casting spells over longships. They stood as experts in a domain the Vikings did not command. That expertise shaped Norse imagination, influenced trade, and tempered ambition. It left traces in saga literature and folklore, and it reminds us that history's most enduring forces are often those rooted quietly in place. If we strip away exaggeration, what remains is perhaps even more compelling than the dramatic headline. Two societies met along a shifting frontier. One excelled at sea. The other excelled on land shaped by snow and migration. Their interaction produced caution, respect, and myth. It did not end in obliteration, but in centuries of adaptation. And under the long, pale light of northern skies, that adaptation tells us something enduring about human history. Power travels far, but it always encounters terrain that demands new understanding. The Vikings learned that lesson in the presence of the Sami, not through terror alone, but through recognition of limits, and through the quiet authority of those who had already mastered the land. As a final reflection, it's worth considering how different this story feels when we remove the language of spectacle and return to the slower rhythms of history. The Vikings have become cultural icons, symbols of movement, ambition, and raw momentum. Their ships crossed oceans. Their names appear in chronicles from Ireland to Byzantium. Yet even a society so mobile was still shaped by geography. And geography, especially in the far north, has a way of reminding every culture of its boundaries. The Sami story within the Viking Age is not dramatic in the conventional sense. There is no single battlefield where banners clashed and one side retreated permanently. Instead, there is a long, patient record of contact. Trade caravans moving between ecological zones, seasonal meetings, occasional tension, occasional cooperation, and above all, a recognition, sometimes quiet, sometimes spoken in myth, that the North operated by its own logic. If we imagine a Norse trader or chieftain traveling northward along the rugged Norwegian coast, then inland toward mountain plateaus, we can begin to sense that shift. The architecture thins. Farms become sparse. Weather patterns grow harsher. Knowledge becomes localized. In such places, the authority of a distant king feels abstract. The authority of the land feels immediate. And those who know the land best naturally command attention. Over generations, this attention crystallized into narrative. Saga writers described Sami figures with heightened language because they represented something liminal, standing between known society and unknown wilderness. In medieval storytelling, liminal figures often carry spiritual weight. They become interpreters of fate, conveyors of hidden knowledge. The Sami were cast into that role not because they sought mystique, but because the Norse imagination needed a way to articulate unfamiliar mastery. Modern research invites us to reinterpret those portrayals carefully. What medieval Scandinavians labeled as sorcery can often be understood as ritual practice embedded in cosmology. What they described as supernatural foresight can be seen as ecological expertise. The gap between perception and explanation is where fear once lived. Close that gap, and fear becomes respect. And yet, even as we demystify the narrative, we should not strip it of meaning. There is something significant in the fact that the Vikings, renowned for boldness, acknowledged limits in the north. They did not erase Sami presence in a single sweep. They did not transform Arctic interiors into mirror images of southern farms. Instead, they negotiated space over centuries. That negotiation itself is evidence of constraint. In the larger sweep of Scandinavian history, the frontier with the Sami reminds us that expansion is rarely uniform. Cultural confidence meets environmental reality. Political ambition meets practical dependence. Myth meets lived experience. The Vikings were at their strongest when sea routes defined connection. In landscapes where mobility required different tools and knowledge systems, they adjusted. Today, the Sami remain a visible and active indigenous people, engaged in cultural revival, political advocacy, and preservation of language and tradition. Their endurance adds a modern dimension to this historical encounter. It underscores that the story did not conclude in the Viking Age. It continued through medieval state-building, early modern centralization, and into contemporary debates about land, rights, and identity. So when we return one last time to the phrase that drew us here, the tribe that terrified the Vikings, we can hear it differently. Not as a tale of dramatic collapse, but as an acknowledgement that power is relative. The Vikings were formidable navigators of the North Atlantic. The Sami were formidable navigators of the Arctic interior. Each society mastered its environment in ways the other could not fully replicate. And perhaps that is the quiet power of this history. It challenges simple hierarchies. It asks us to see strength not only in conquest, but in continuity. Not only in expansion, but in adaptation. The Vikings sailed widely and left their mark across continents. The Sami stayed rooted in a demanding landscape and endured across centuries. Under the vast northern sky, where winter darkness stretches long and silence carries weight, both societies shaped each other's memory. The Vikings learned caution. The Sami preserved resilience. And in that shared frontier, history reminds us that even the boldest cultures must sometimes pause, look around, and recognize that mastery belongs to those who understand the land beneath their feet. As we let the final layers of this story settle, it becomes clear that what endured between the Vikings and the Sami was not a rivalry defined by conquest, but a long awareness of one another's strengths. In many ways, the Arctic frontier functioned as a quiet teacher. It exposed the limits of technology, the fragility of supply lines, and the reality that courage alone does not guarantee survival. The Vikings, whose identity was closely tied to movement and maritime innovation, encountered in the Sami a society whose stability came from deep-rooted adaptation rather than outward expansion. There is something profoundly human in that encounter. Throughout history, cultures often measure strength by visibility, by monuments, fleets, armies, or territory claimed. The Vikings excelled in visible forms of power. Their ships were engineering achievements. Their settlements left archaeological footprints. Their influence can be traced across maps of medieval Europe. The Sami, by contrast, left lighter physical traces. Their wealth was mobile. Their expertise was embedded in seasonal patterns. Their knowledge was stored in practice and oral tradition rather than monumental architecture. And yet, when Norse communities moved northward, they found that visibility did not equal dominance. A society that thrives in harsh climates develops forms of resilience that are not easily quantified. The Sami did not need fortified cities to secure their position. Their strength lay in environmental fluency, knowing when rivers would freeze safely, where herds would travel, how snow conditions would shift under changing wind. In extreme environments, such knowledge outweighs military numbers. Over centuries, this recognition shaped interaction. Norse elites sought northern goods. Traders relied on Sami intermediaries. Travelers required guidance across unfamiliar terrain. Even as political systems attempted to formalize control, practical dependence remained. That dependence is perhaps the clearest sign that fear, in this context, was less about panic and more about respect sharpened by uncertainty. As Christianity spread and Scandinavian kingdoms matured, older narratives of sorcery slowly transformed. What had once been described as powerful magic was increasingly dismissed by church authorities. Ritual drums were condemned. Indigenous cosmologies were challenged. Yet cultural transformation does not erase memory. The image of the North as a realm of hidden strength persisted in folklore long after official attitudes shifted. For modern viewers, this layered history offers something steady and reflective. It suggests that encounters between societies are rarely defined solely by violence or dominance. They are shaped by adaptation, exchange, misunderstanding, and gradual negotiation. The Vikings and the Sami shared a long border not just on maps, but in lived experience. That border was sometimes tense, sometimes cooperative, always dynamic. When we strip away exaggeration, what remains is arguably more compelling than the dramatic headline. The Vikings were not undone by terror. They were confronted with a landscape and a people who operated according to different principles of survival. They recognized that difference. They adapted where necessary. They mythologized what they did not fully understand. And they continued to engage. In the grand narrative of the Viking Age, overseas raids often dominate attention. Yet the northern frontier tells a quieter story, one about coexistence in a demanding environment. It reminds us that history is not only written in spectacular events, but also in sustained relationships. Over time, those relationships shape perception as deeply as any battle. The Sami did not conquer the Vikings. They did not need to. Their endurance within their own ecological sphere demonstrated a form of authority that expansion alone cannot guarantee. Under the shifting light of Arctic seasons, where winter darkness yields slowly to summer brightness, resilience became the defining measure of strength. And so the legend finds its resolution not in fear, but in perspective. The Vikings, renowned for crossing oceans, met a people who mastered snow and silence. They encountered limits, and in doing so, they expanded not only their trade routes, but their understanding of what power truly means. History often celebrates movement. This story reminds us to also honor rootedness. The Vikings moved outward with ambition. The Sami remained anchored to the rhythms of their land. In that contrast, both societies left an imprint on one another. And in that shared northern landscape, beneath vast skies and quiet horizons, the lesson endured. Mastery belongs to those who understand the ground beneath them, and even the boldest explorers must sometimes listen to those who have always been there. As we close this long journey through the northern frontier of the Viking world, it helps to imagine the landscape one last time, not as a dramatic battlefield, but as it truly was. A wide plateau under pale winter light, forest lines bending under snow, rivers locked in ice, silence stretching for miles, broken only by wind or the distant movement of animals. In such a place, power does not announce itself loudly. It operates quietly, through knowledge, timing, and restraint. The Vikings, for all their maritime brilliance, were not immune to the humbling force of that environment. Their ships represented freedom along coasts and rivers, but inland winter rendered timber hulls irrelevant. Their social structures thrived in farming districts and trade hubs, but Arctic interiors demanded a different rhythm. The farther north they moved, the more they encountered a society whose strengths were not visible in carved halls or monumental graves, but in lived precision. The Sami understood cycles rather than campaigns. Their survival depended on reading subtle shifts, snow density, reindeer behavior, wind direction, seasonal light. These were not dramatic skills, yet in an unforgiving climate they were decisive. When Norse travelers relied on Sami guides, they were acknowledging something fundamental, that mastery of place cannot be improvised. Over generations, this recognition shaped memory. Medieval Norse writers struggled to categorize what they observed. Without modern scientific frameworks, environmental expertise could easily be interpreted as supernatural agency. If storms seemed to follow ritual words, or successful hunts aligned with ceremonial timing, the explanation available within Norse cosmology was sorcery. And so the Sami entered saga literature not merely as neighbors, but as figures associated with hidden forces. Yet the deeper story remains grounded in pragmatism. Norse chieftains valued northern goods. Furs and Arctic products were woven into trade networks that strengthened political authority. The Sami were not isolated from these systems. They were integral to them. Economic interdependence ensured continued contact, even when cultural perceptions were layered with myth. As Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated power, tribute systems evolved into structured taxation. Christianization reframed spiritual difference as theological deviation. Administrative boundaries hardened. But the Arctic itself did not change to accommodate southern governance. Harsh winters persisted. Migration routes endured. Environmental knowledge remained indispensable. Even as states expanded, they could not eliminate reliance on those who knew the land intimately. This is where the narrative gains its lasting relevance. The phrase, "the only tribe that terrified the Vikings," captures attention because it reverses expected dominance. Yet the real significance lies not in terror, but in balance. The Vikings excelled where water connected worlds. The Sami excelled where land and climate imposed severe constraints. Neither strength erased the other. Instead, they coexisted along a shifting frontier defined by mutual awareness. History often magnifies dramatic clashes while overlooking sustained adaptation. In truth, the relationship between Vikings and Sami was defined less by confrontation and more by long-term negotiation. There were moments of tension, certainly. There were systems of tribute that imposed hierarchy. There were missionary campaigns that challenged spiritual traditions. But there was also exchange, cooperation, and continuity. For modern audiences across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, countries with histories shaped by frontiers and indigenous resilience, this story resonates beyond Scandinavia. It invites reflection on how expanding societies interpret difference. It reminds us that labeling unfamiliar expertise as mystical or threatening is a common human response. And it suggests that respect, even when framed as fear, can signal acknowledgement of limits. In the end, the Vikings were not undone by the Sami. They were educated by the frontier. They learned that courage and innovation have boundaries shaped by terrain. They encountered a people whose adaptation to Arctic life demanded recognition. That recognition, filtered through medieval imagination, became legend. But beneath legend lies something quieter and more enduring. The Sami persisted. Through Viking contact, through medieval state building, through early modern centralization, and into the present they maintained cultural continuity. That persistence is perhaps the clearest testament to the strength that once unsettled Norse confidence. So when we think of the northern edge of the Viking world, we should picture not a scene of terror, but a moment of realization. Longships at anchor, traders negotiating, travelers pausing before crossing into harsher ground. And in that pause and understanding that mastery depends on place, and that every expansion eventually meets a landscape and a people who redefine what power means. Under the vast Arctic sky, where seasons shift slowly and silence carries weight, the Vikings encountered not defeat, but perspective. And in that perspective, the story finds its true depth, calm, complex, and enduring long after the sails disappeared from the horizon. As we draw this exploration to its final, reflective pause, it is worth considering how stories like this survive in the first place. They endure not because they are loud, but because they touch something universal. The idea that the Vikings, figures so often portrayed as fearless, encountered a people who unsettled them speaks to a deeper human truth. Every culture, no matter how confident, eventually meets a boundary that reshapes its self-image. In the Viking Age, that boundary was not only geographical. It was intellectual and ecological. The Sami represented a different model of strength, one not measured in ships launched or territories seized, but in the ability to sustain life across generations in one of Europe's most demanding climates. Their authority was subtle. It did not depend on centralized halls or written law codes. It rested on intimate familiarity with land and season. For Norse communities accustomed to asserting identity through visible markers, farms, assemblies, maritime expeditions, this quieter form of mastery could feel elusive. When you cannot easily measure or replicate another society's competence, it acquires an aura. In medieval Scandinavia, that aura was often expressed through the language of magic. What today we might call environmental science or adaptive strategy was then described as weatherworking or prophecy. But beyond literary embellishment, the relationship between Vikings and Sami demonstrates a pattern repeated across history. Expansion always encounters adaptation. Mobility meets rootedness. Technological advantage meets environmental constraint. The Vikings excelled in connecting coastlines and river systems across vast distances. The Sami excelled in navigating tundra, forest, and snow where maritime advantage dissolved. Neither society was inherently superior. Each was optimized for its landscape. When those landscapes overlapped, the result was not simple conquest, but negotiation shaped by necessity. Trade persisted. Knowledge was exchanged. Political structures attempted to extend control, yet remained dependent on local expertise. Over centuries, this dynamic produced layers of myth, administration, resistance, and coexistence. Even as later Scandinavian states intensified efforts to integrate northern territories, the essential truth remained. Arctic environments demand respect. Infrastructure can extend reach, but it cannot erase climate. Governance can redraw borders, but it cannot rewrite seasons. The Sami, whose lifeways evolved in alignment with those seasons, carried forward a continuity that outlasted the Viking Age itself. For modern viewers, this continuity offers perspective. It challenges us to look beyond dramatic headlines and consider endurance as a measure of power. The Vikings left archaeological monuments and written sagas. The Sami left cultural memory embedded in language, music, and relationship to land. Both forms of legacy matter. Yet one reminds us that resilience is often quieter than conquest. When we revisit the phrase, "the only tribe that terrified the Vikings," we now hear it differently, not as a literal account of armies fleeing in panic, but as a metaphor for encountering limits. The Vikings were bold explorers of sea routes and founders of distant settlements. In the Arctic North, however, they met a society that required them to listen, adapt, and proceed with caution. That experience unsettled certainty, and certainty is often what power relies upon. Under long northern winters, where daylight thins and silence deepens, the lessons of that frontier would have felt immediate. Survival demanded humility. Knowledge had to be shared. Cooperation was often wiser than confrontation. In that environment, fear transformed into respect, and respect into enduring narrative. So as we close this documentary journey, we are left not with a tale of dramatic defeat, but with something richer. The Vikings did not fall before the Sami. They encountered a people whose mastery of their environment commanded acknowledgement. That acknowledgement reshaped perception and left traces in saga and folklore. And perhaps that is the quiet beauty of this history. It reminds us that strength is always contextual, that every expanding horizon contains a boundary where confidence must yield to learning. The Vikings sailed far, but in the far north they discovered that some forms of power are rooted, patient, and enduring. Beneath the vast Arctic sky, where seasons turn with steady rhythm and memory travels across generations, the story of Vikings and Sami settles into balance. Not terror, not conquest, but recognition. And in recognition, a deeper understanding of what it truly means to master a world. As we take one final, unhurried look at this northern frontier, it becomes clear that the enduring power of this story lies not in spectacle, but in contrast. The Viking Age is often framed as an era of outward thrust, of sails on open water, of horizons expanding with each voyage. Yet every outward movement eventually meets resistance, and sometimes that resistance is not an army, but an environment already deeply understood by others. The Sami did not build fleets to rival the longship. They did not carve kingdoms along distant coasts. Their strength was quieter and more localized, but no less sophisticated. It was built on accumulated observation, generations refining knowledge of snow conditions, animal migrations, fishing cycles, and shifting weather. In the Arctic and subarctic, survival rewards attention rather than aggression. It favors those who move with the land rather than against it. When Norse communities pushed northward in search of trade, tribute, and influence, they entered a landscape that required recalibration. The assumptions that worked along fjords and fertile valleys did not always hold across mountain plateaus or tundra. A misjudged journey in winter could be fatal. Supplies could vanish under unexpected storms. In such settings, those who held local expertise held real authority. It is in that lived reality that the roots of fear must be understood, not as battlefield terror, but as an awareness of vulnerability. The Vikings were not invincible. No society is. They thrived in maritime corridors. On Arctic ground, they were guests. That shift in position, however temporary, has a way of altering perception. Over time, that perception filtered into story, and story became saga. Saga literature, shaped by memory and imagination, amplified difference. The Sami became figures associated with foresight and hidden forces. Their ritual practices, unfamiliar to Norse observers, were translated into the language available at the time: sorcery, enchantment, weatherworking. But beneath literary framing lay a simpler truth. The North demanded skills the Vikings did not possess in equal measure. As centuries passed, political structures hardened and administrative reach extended into northern territories. Yet even centralized states could not erase environmental constraint. Roads, churches, and tax systems could be established, but snow still fell. Rivers still froze. Reindeer still migrated. The ecological foundations of Sami life remained relevant, and in many ways indispensable. For modern audiences, this layered history invites reflection on how easily narratives of dominance overshadow narratives of adaptation. It is tempting to remember the Vikings solely as conquerors and the Sami solely as marginalized. The reality is more complex. There was imbalance, certainly. There were pressures and inequities, especially in later centuries. But there was also sustained interaction and recognition that neither society could simply erase the other from the northern landscape. The legend of the tribe that terrified the Vikings survives because it captures that recognition in dramatic shorthand. Yet the deeper story reveals something more instructive, that power always has context. Remove a society from the conditions in which it thrives, and its confidence must adjust. The Vikings did not cease to be skilled sailors when they entered Sami territories. But sailing skill did not guarantee Arctic mastery, and so the frontier between them was defined not by a single decisive clash, but by centuries of cautious engagement. Trade, tribute, cultural borrowing, spiritual misunderstanding, political consolidation. All of these threads wove together into a durable relationship. It was neither pure harmony nor constant hostility. It was something far more human, coexistence under shifting circumstances. In the quiet of the far north, where winter nights stretch long and the sky glows faintly with aurora, the lesson would have felt immediate. Survival required humility. Strength required specialization. Respect, even when expressed as fear, was practical wisdom. As we close this documentary, the image that remains is not of Vikings fleeing in panic, but of travelers pausing at the edge of unfamiliar terrain, of recognizing that beyond this point, another kind of knowledge leads, of understanding that mastery is never universal. The Vikings left their mark across seas and continents. The Sami remained rooted in Arctic rhythms that predated and outlasted the Viking Age. In their meeting, history offers us a steady reminder. Expansion reaches far, but endurance runs deep. And sometimes the quietest strength is the one that shapes memory the longest. If we allow ourselves one last slow reflection, the story of the Vikings and the Sami ultimately becomes a meditation on perspective. For centuries, popular imagination has centered the Vikings as the defining force of the North, restless, bold, and transformative. Yet history, when examined carefully, rarely revolves around a single axis. Alongside the maritime world of longships and coastal strongholds existed another North. Inland, snowbound, cyclical, and deeply attuned to seasonal change. That North did not vanish when the sails appeared on the horizon. Continued, steady, and self-contained. The Sami presence in that landscape predated the Viking Age and continued well beyond it. Their expertise was cumulative, refined through repeated interaction with one of Europe's harshest climates. This expertise was not theoretical. It was lived daily, choosing migration routes that balanced grazing and shelter, reading the texture of snow to determine safe passage, adjusting to subtle shifts in light that signaled seasonal transition. In environments where error can mean death, such precision becomes a quiet authority. When Norse communities expanded northward, seeking resources and influence, they encountered not an empty frontier but a working system. That system did not depend on monumental structures or centralized rule. It depended on mobility and memory. To those accustomed to measuring strength in visible institutions, assembly sites, fortified farms, fleets, this form of strength could appear elusive. Yet its effectiveness was undeniable. This is why the language of fear entered the narrative. Fear, in this context, did not stem from overwhelming force. It emerged from uncertainty. The Vikings understood navigation by stars and currents. The Sami understood navigation by snow and land contour. When two knowledge systems overlap, but do not fully translate. Each side recognizes its own limits. In the Norse case, that recognition found expression in saga motifs of sorcery and prophecy. But sagas, though rich in atmosphere, are shaped by literary intention. They heighten contrast to explore fate and destiny. Modern scholarship invites us to look beneath their drama and identify the structural realities underneath. Trade networks, tribute arrangements, shifting political boundaries, gradual Christianization. These processes reveal a frontier defined less by terror than by sustained negotiation. As Scandinavian kingdoms strengthened in the late medieval period, administrative structures extended deeper into northern territories. Tax registers replaced oral agreements. Missionaries challenged indigenous cosmologies. Over time, asymmetries of power increased. Yet, even within these changing frameworks, environmental dependence remained constant. Arctic survival still required local knowledge. Political authority could impose obligations, but it could not rewrite geography. And geography in this story is perhaps the central character. It shaped both societies in different ways. The Vikings mastered the sea's connective power. The Sami mastered the land's enduring rhythms. When these two forms of mastery met, neither dissolved entirely into the other. Instead, they coexisted, sometimes tensely, sometimes cooperatively, within a shared northern world. For viewers today, especially in countries whose own histories include frontier encounters, this narrative offers a grounded reminder. Expansion often carries confidence. Encounter introduces complexity. Over time, complexity demands humility. The Vikings did not lose their identity in the north, but they did encounter a people whose adaptation challenged simple dominance. So when we hear that the Sami were the only tribe that terrified the Vikings, we can reinterpret that line not as exaggeration, but as acknowledgement. It signals that even a society famed for daring recognized when it stood on unfamiliar ground. It signals that expertise rooted in place commands respect, whether or not it is wrapped in visible power. Under the vast Arctic sky, where light fades and returns in long cycles, the story settles into clarity. The Vikings expanded outward with remarkable energy. The Sami endured inward with remarkable steadiness. In their meeting, history offers no simple victor. Instead, it offers balance. And perhaps that balance is the most meaningful conclusion. Strength is not universal. It is contextual. Fear is not always panic. It is often recognition. The Vikings encountered in the Sami a reminder that the world contains multiple forms of mastery. And in acknowledging that, they left behind a legend that still invites us to look beyond spectacle and into the quieter truths of survival, adaptation, and enduring presence. If we let the camera linger just a little longer on this northern horizon, one final truth comes into focus. The encounter between the Vikings and the Sami was not an interruption in history. It was continuity meeting continuity. Both societies were already fully formed, already adapted to their respective environments, long before they became central to one another's stories. The Vikings did not invent the North. They entered it. And the Sami were not a footnote in Viking expansion. They were a constant presence in a landscape that shaped the limits of that expansion. What often goes unspoken in simplified narratives is that the Vikings themselves were not universally at ease in every Scandinavian environment. Coastal Norway, with its fjords and navigable waters, was their natural corridor. Inland mountain regions were harder to cultivate and govern. Even within Norse society, regional variation was significant. That means when Vikings pushed further north, they were not merely confronting a different people. They were confronting a harsher version of their own geography. The Sami, by contrast, were specialists of that harsher geography. Their economy was structured around mobility because mobility was practical. Their spiritual worldview was tied to natural cycles because survival depended on seasonal precision. Their social organization reflected adaptation rather than territorial control. None of this made them mystical. It made them effective. But effectiveness, when not understood, often becomes myth. When Norse sagas describe Sami individuals as foretelling weather or influencing events, they reveal something about medieval psychology. In a world without meteorology or ecological science, prediction appears supernatural. If a Sami guide advised delaying travel because wind patterns suggested an incoming storm, and that storm arrived on schedule, what explanation seemed available? Within Norse cosmology, such insight could be framed as magic. Over generations, practical experiences layered into legend. And legend, repeated often enough, acquires emotional weight. The Sami became figures who occupied a threshold in Norse imagination, neither fully integrated nor entirely foreign, but set slightly apart, associated with forces beyond ordinary understanding. Yet behind this imaginative framing lay something grounded: interdependence. Norse elites depended on northern trade. Arctic goods enhanced wealth and status. The farther north political authority extended, the more it relied on systems already in place. Tribute arrangements did not emerge in a vacuum. They were built on established networks of exchange. Even as medieval states hardened administrative structures, they did so atop relationships that predated centralized rule. Over time, especially in the later medieval and early modern periods, power imbalances grew clearer. Taxation systems expanded. Missionary campaigns intensified. Cultural suppression occurred in various forms. But the Viking Age itself remains distinct, a period when mutual awareness preceded rigid governance. And in that earlier period, fear functioned less as hostility and more as caution. The Vikings were not strangers to caution. Successful sailors must read signs carefully. The same instinct applied inland. The North demanded attention. Those who ignored its rhythms suffered consequences. Those who respected local expertise improved their chances. For modern audiences, this offers a perspective shift. We often frame history through decisive moments, conquests, collapses, revolutions. But much of human experience unfolds through prolonged coexistence. The Vikings and the Sami shared centuries of borderland interaction. Some years would have passed quietly, defined by trade and seasonal movement. Others would have carried tension. Rarely was there a single defining climax. This steadiness matters. It reminds us that the most enduring historical forces are often environmental and cultural rather than purely military. The Arctic did not yield to spectacle. It rewarded preparation. It favored those who knew when to move and when to wait. And so the phrase that drew us into this story, "the only tribe that terrified the Vikings," resolves into something subtler. The Sami did not terrorize through overwhelming force. They unsettled through difference, through expertise the Vikings could not easily replicate, through mastery of terrain that resisted easy control. In that encounter, the Vikings discovered a boundary not drawn on maps but inscribed in climate and culture. They adjusted, they negotiated, they mythologized, and they continued. The Sami, for their part, endured. Their continuity through centuries of political transformation stands as quiet testimony to the strength that once commanded Norse respect. That continuity is not dramatic, but it is profound. Under northern skies that shift slowly from endless daylight to prolonged darkness, history unfolds at a different pace. It is less about sudden flashes and more about long arcs. The Viking ships eventually faded from prominence. Kingdoms rose and restructured, but the land remained, and those attuned to it remained with it. And perhaps that is the final, steady lesson of this story. Expansion reaches outward, but endurance holds ground. The Vikings were bold navigators of sea and story. The Sami were steadfast navigators of land and season. In their meeting, neither erased the other. Instead, they left us a memory shaped by recognition. A reminder that every culture, however confident, encounters spaces where it must listen rather than lead. And in that listening, history finds its balance. As we arrive at the quiet edge of this long exploration, it becomes clear that the story of the Vikings and the Sami is less about fear in its dramatic sense and more about recognition in its enduring sense. Recognition that landscapes shape power. Recognition that knowledge is not uniform. Recognition that even societies known for expansion must sometimes recalibrate when they encounter a different kind of mastery. The Viking Age has often been defined by movement. Ships cutting through cold seas, settlements planted on distant shores, trade routes stretching across continents. Movement implies momentum. It suggests a culture pushing forward with confidence. But movement also depends on corridors where that confidence can operate effectively. The sea was such a corridor for the Norse. The Arctic interior was not. For the Sami, movement had a different meaning. It was not about conquest or colonization. It was about seasonal adaptation. Migration followed ecological necessity rather than political ambition. Mobility was woven into survival, not expansion. That distinction shaped how each society understood the world. The Vikings measured distance in nautical miles and trade routes. The Sami measured it in grazing cycles and winter passage. When these two ways of moving intersected, misunderstanding was almost inevitable. Norse observers, accustomed to visible authority structures, encountered a society whose power was distributed through practice rather than centralized command. There were no grand halls announcing control, no fleets signaling dominance. Instead, there was competence that revealed itself only in action, on snowfields, in forests, along frozen rivers. In medieval narrative traditions, such competence was difficult to categorize. It did not align neatly with familiar institutions, so it was framed in symbolic language. The Sami became associated with seer, prophecy, weatherworking. This was not merely fantasy. It was the vocabulary available at the time to explain expertise that seemed extraordinary. Over time, these portrayals solidified into motifs. The North became a place where hidden forces resided. The Sami became intermediaries between known society and untamed landscape. But when we look past the literary framing, what remains is an economic and ecological partnership shaped by realism. Norse leaders valued Arctic goods and sought to incorporate northern resources into expanding political networks. That required cooperation. Even when tribute systems developed, they did not eliminate reliance on Sami knowledge. Geography ensured that authority could extend only so far without local guidance. As centuries passed and centralized states grew stronger, the tone of interaction shifted. Administrative categorization replaced mythic framing. Missionary zeal replaced wary fascination. But environmental dependence persisted beneath political change. The Arctic did not become predictable simply because it was mapped. Today, with modern technology and infrastructure, it is easy to underestimate the vulnerability of pre-modern travel in northern climates. A sudden storm, a misread river crossing, a failed hunt, these could end lives quickly. In that context, those who held accurate environmental knowledge held quiet power. Respecting that power was not superstition. It was prudence. For contemporary audiences across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, nations with their own histories of frontier encounters, this story carries a familiar resonance. It reminds us that indigenous knowledge systems are often misunderstood by expanding societies, yet prove indispensable in challenging environments. It reminds us that labeling unfamiliar expertise as mystical or threatening is a common human reflex. So when we revisit the phrase that sparked this documentary, the tribe that terrified the Vikings, we can now interpret it with clarity. The Sami did not terrify through overwhelming violence. They unsettled through difference and depth of adaptation. They occupied a domain where Viking strengths diminished and local expertise prevailed. And in that domain, the Vikings did what successful societies often do when faced with limits. They adjusted. They traded. They learned. They told stories to make sense of what they encountered. The result was not annihilation, but coexistence. Not collapse, but recalibration. The Viking Age ended for many reasons: political consolidation, Christianization, economic shifts, but not because of a northern tribe. Yet the northern frontier left its imprint on Viking imagination, shaping how they understood power and place. Under the wide arc of Arctic seasons, where light lingers for months and then recedes into long darkness, history moves at a measured pace. The Vikings sailed boldly into memory. The Sami endured steadily within it. Their meeting produced legend, but its foundation was respect. And perhaps that is the most enduring image to carry forward. Not ships fleeing in panic, but travelers pausing at the edge of unfamiliar ground, recognizing that here knowledge takes a different form. recognizing that mastery belongs to those who listen closely to the land, and understanding, quietly and without spectacle, that even the most confident explorers must sometimes learn from those who have always called that place home.